Thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's second-rate copper NBN
Members on my right.
is creating a digital divide across Australia, with the one side of some streets getting first-rate fibre, while the other side gets second-rate copper. How is this fair? Will the Prime Minister admit that his second-rate copper NBN is creating a digital divide across this nation?
The Leader of the Opposition's time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, few things better demonstrate the incompetence of the Labor Party than the conception of the NBN during that glorious Conrovian era, when in 6 years, Mr Speaker, 6 years, this crack band of managers, these fearless entrepreneurs, succeeded in connecting 51,000 premises to the NBN in 6 years. The NBN right now is doing more than that every 10 days. That's the difference. Getting on with the job and building it. The Labor Party said, when they announced that they were going to establish a government company to build a national broadband network, that it would be the most fantastic commercial opportunity. Kevin Rudd said that mums and dads would be lining up to invest. But he was stern about this, Mr Speaker. He said even though it was going to be the best investment ever, the government would hold 51%. He was going to hold back all of that wall of investment enthusiasm to limit it to 49%. Well, what a train wreck it was. Tens of billions of dollars wasted by the Labor Party, leaving us with the biggest corporate train wreck ever undertaken by a federal government. Now, what we've done is we've got on with the job. We've got on with the job, and we're playing the hand of cards we were dealt by Labor, and we're building it. We're building it for $30 billion less than it would have done under Labor, and 6 to 8 years at less time. And you know, I've heard the Shadow Minister talk about regional Australia. Well, I'm sure when she gets there she'll find it very interesting. Let me tell you, Mr Speaker, under our construction program of the NBN, regional Australia is getting finished sooner. The satellite is up, and the fixed wireless component will be completed next year. So the reality is we're getting on with the job. Over 3 million premises are connected. And as far as the digital divide that the honourable member spoke about, he'll be interested to know that whether people are connected by fibre to the premises, fibre to the node, hybrid fibre coax, or indeed by fixed wireless, the vast majority are ordering speeds of 25 megabits per second or less.
For members on my left, I remind the member for Cowan she's been warned. She continues to interject. If she continues to do so, she'll be ejected. And the members for Bendigo and Braddon are on notice. The member for CORANGAMITE has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's energy plan will guarantee reliability so that hard-working Australians and businesses get the affordable and reliable energy they need, including in my electorate of Corangamite?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. She understands very well the importance of affordable and reliable energy. So many jobs in her electorate depend upon affordable and reliable energy. And the one thing that her constituents know is that Labor's folly with energy has one consequence: more expensive and less reliable energy. The reality is this, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party has conducted a massive, incompetent experiment on Australian families and businesses with their energy policies, or lack of them. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party, the Leader of the Opposition here, he wants us to cut our emissions by twice as much as we agreed to do at Paris. twice as much, unilaterally. He has done no modelling on the cost of that at all. The only modelling that's been available, Mr Speaker, which has come from the department, suggests that would involve an additional cost of $66 billion. That is an additional cost in order to meet a target twice what we've agreed to in Paris. And, Mr Speaker, we know that the consequence of Labor is always higher electricity prices and less reliable energy. Now, what we have now is a recommendation from the Energy Security Board that will deliver affordable and reliable energy and will enable us to meet our emissions reduction obligations. Affordability, reliability, responsibility. And this is not a political proposal. It's come from the experts in the business. It's come from the experts appointed by COAG, more Labor governments and coalition governments, chaired by an independent chairman with the energy market operator, the rules maker, the regulator, all on that board. And this is what they've recommended. Correct. And what did the Leader of the Opposition say in response to that? He called it science fiction. Then he called it nonsense. No respect whatsoever for people whose intellect and experience makes them the best qualified in the industry. And it's no wonder, Mr Speaker, that one group after another is endorsing our national energy guarantee. The head of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it solves a whole bunch of problems in an incredibly elegant way. That's what they say. And, Mr Speaker, we've seen from ACCI, we've seen from AIG, we've seen from the Minerals Council, we've seen from the BCA, we've seen from BlueScope, from BHP, right across the board, support for this energy guarantee. Labor should back it and back the efforts of the experts.
The member for Greenway.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Today, the Prime Minister's hand-picked NBN CEO, Bill Morrow, said about the NBN, and I quote, "It's too early to tell whether or not it's a success or a failure." In the 5th year of the Prime Minister's mismanagement of his second-rate copper NBN, when no one else is to blame, is this really the best the government can do? Why isn't the Prime Minister doing anything to fix the problems which are plaguing the NBN on his watch?
The Leader of the House and the member for Greenway will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting, as will the member for Greenway. The Minister has the call.
I do thank the Shadow Minister for the question, which I'm delighted to have the opportunity to answer, because I think it's timely to remind ourselves of how we got here. How did we get here? And the Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the murky land of Conrovia. But there's another land. There's another land where there was briefly responsibility for the NBN, the land of Albonia, because we remember, Mr. Speaker.
I caution the minister.
The member for Greenway. The member for Greenway briefly had responsibility for the NBN. It was during that downfall phase of the Rudd government. It's like that scene in the bunker in the movie Downfall, when Kevin Rudd was bringing together his loyal band of supporters and he was handing out battlefield promotions, and the member for Greenway got responsibility for the NBN.
The Minister will resume his seat.
You're loving this, come on.
Members on my right are delaying question time.
He's loving it, though.
The member for Greenway with a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. None of us are from the land of nitwits, and he's certainly not a wit.
The member for Greenway is warned, and he will resume his seat. I'm discounting for provocation. That's true. The minister has the call.
During his brief period as minister, and members would recollect from discussions in the House last week that in the 4 years between Kevin Rudd announcing the new NBN and Labor scuttling out of office, members would remember that in the seat of Dobell, the number of services on the fixed network in those 4 years went from 0 to 0. In 4 years, they went from 0 to 0. And unsurprisingly, in his brief period as the minister, the member for Greenway was asked some questions about how the Labor Party was administering the NBN. And what he had to say was this. In a press conference, he said, "You mightn't like the answer. We are rolling out the NBN as fast as it can be rolled out." That's what he said. We are rolling out the NBN as fast as it could be rolled out, and just a couple of months later, they exited office with barely 50,000 premises able to connect. Barely 50,000 premises able to connect. We now have well over 6 million premises able to connect and over 2 million that actually are connected. So when the Shadow Minister says, when the Shadow Minister presumes to contrast this government's record of delivery of the NBN with Labor's shambolic and hopeless record, I say to her, we didn't want to start from where we did, but we have been getting on with the job. Over 6 million premises now able to connect.
The minister's time
that's very
has
important.
concluded. The member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer advise the House how the National Energy Guarantee provides certainty for hard-working Australians and businesses? How does the government's commitment to guarantee affordable and reliable energy support business investment and secure better days ahead for our economy?
The Treasurer has the call. The member for Bruce. Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Goldstein. Like all of those on this side of the House, we remain optimistic about the Australian economy and the better days ahead that we are focused on securing. That is the emerging national and international consensus. The better days ahead are coming true, Mr Speaker. We're seeing it in the global economy as the global economy turns, and we're seeing it in the jobs figures, Mr Speaker, that were released last week. Jobs growth in Australia today is now running at more than 3% a year. That is 15 times the rate it was growing under the Labor Party back in 2013. 15 times the rate of jobs growth than was achieved by the Labor Party back in 2013 when they left office. We have also just experienced the strongest growth in full-time jobs in a 12-month period in record. Of the 40 years of record of the Labor Force Survey, Mr Speaker, some 316,000 full-time jobs created in a 12-month period. And it was the 12th consecutive month with 20,000 jobs created in September that we have had consecutive jobs growth, and that is the longest consecutive run of monthly jobs growth in 23 years, Mr Speaker. Now, I see that as evidence of better days ahead that we talked about in May of emerging, Mr Speaker, but those opposite can't even bring themselves to congratulate the Australian businesses and Australians that went out there and got a job in the last 12 months, preferring to talk down the economy, Mr Speaker, and look for every single black cloud there is on the horizon rather than seeing that, as Deloitte said today, the clouds are breaking apart, Mr Speaker, for our economy, and we can welcome that. In fact, Chris Richardson from Deloitte said today that Australian jobs growth, this was Chris Richardson from Deloitte Economics, said that Australian jobs growth was a thing of beauty, Mr Speaker. A thing of beauty. That's what he said today, and he has also gone on to reinforce the need to increase business investment to ensure that Australians' jobs growth remains strong and it leads to higher wages. Now, we take that seriously. That's why our enterprise tax plan has already given tax cuts for businesses up to $50 million in turnover, covering more than half of the Australian labour force. But the Labor Party remains opposed to not only those tax cuts, which they will reverse, Mr Speaker, if they're elected, taking tax cuts away from small business, but they stand in the way of the tax cuts that will assist the other half of the labour force by ensuring greater investment in our economy through business. But certainty is required for business investment, and that's what the National Energy Guarantee is providing. The National Energy Guarantee provides certainty for businesses to invest in greater energy supply to ensure more affordable and more reliable energy for Australian businesses so they can continue to invest in their businesses and create even more Australian jobs, Mr Speaker. The National Energy Guarantee means more and better paid jobs, and Labor remain opposed.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. We are now in the 5th year of this government, and for years the Prime Minister has made a choice, first as Communications Minister and now as Prime Minister, to build a second-rate copper NBN instead of a first-rate fibre NBN. When will the Prime Minister stop blaming everybody else and finally take some responsibility for the system he's been in charge of for years and years?
The Prime Minister has to call. The member for Gilmore will cease interjecting.
Mr Speaker,
The member for McEwen is warned.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and his communication spokesman, neither of them understand the technologies for the NBN at all. Now, let's deal with some facts, Mr Speaker. Had the government, had the coalition continued with fibre to the premises as proposed by Labor, it would have taken 6 to 8 years longer and $30 billion more. If you spend, that meant that people who had no broadband would have been waiting for many years longer to get it, and the cost of providing it would have obviously been much higher because the capital cost would be greater. Now, the only advantage of the fibre, or the big advantage of fibre to the premises, is that it can carry a higher line speed. You can get, that's the deal. That's the proposition. Well, Mr Speaker, let me make this observation. The NBN now knows what Australians are prepared to pay for. 79% of people on fibre to the premises order speeds of 25 megabits per second or less. And they're on fibre to the premises. And 87% of fibre to the node order speeds of 25 megabits or less. 77% of those on hybrid fibre coax order speeds of 25 megs or less. And the same pattern is true with fixed wireless and fibre to the basement. So the whole premise of the fibre to the premises argument by the Labor Party has been comprehensively disproved by what the public are prepared to do and use. It was a folly the way the Labor Party set it up, and we are sorting it out.
I caution those members who've been warned it might only be Monday, but they will not defy my earlier warnings. They know who they are. And I just also say, particularly to the member for McEwen, who's the second Deputy Speaker, I mention him most days. I think today is a good day for a rostered day off. The member for Indi.
Thank you. We might just reset that clock.
Yes, yeah, the clock will start
Thank you.
at 45
to the
seconds.
Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. On the 14th of September this year, Minister, you told Parliament in question time that there will be about 200 asylum seekers found not to be refugees moved into another detention centre in PNG, and there are now 8 days until the Manus Centre closes. Can you provide an update on how many asylum seekers will be left behind after the 31st of October? What will happen to them? And will the government continue to provide these asylum seekers, in line with UN Convention, with appropriate medical and health care, torture and trauma support and security services?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member sincerely for her question. I appreciated her question in September, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide her with an update again today in relation to the situation. As she is aware, both Prime Ministers O'Neill and Turnbull announced earlier this year that the Regional Processing Centre in Nauru would close on the 31st of October, and we are able to do that because we haven't had a successful boat arrival in now over 1,100 days. So we're seeing the population detention dwindle quite dramatically, and appropriately so, as not as quick as we would want, but still we've been given this difficult situation and we're in the process of cleaning it up. What we've said, Mr Speaker, is that we have the ability to transfer some people to the East Lorengau Transit Centre. So at the moment in the Regional Processing Centre, the population is at 606. The non-refugees that the honourable member speaks of number 141, and we have the ability in the new facility at Hillside House to accommodate 198 people that have been found not to be refugees. So at the moment, as I say, within the Regional Processing Centre there's 141. So those people, on our proposal with the PNG government, will move into Hillside House. There's the ability for the refugees, that is the balance of the 606, to move from the Regional Processing Centre into East Lorengau and into another facility that we've set up there. So there is that capacity, Mr Speaker, and we want to do it as quickly as possible. As the honourable member knows, the Prime Minister was able to negotiate an arrangement with the United States which will see in the order of some 1,200 people move from Manus and Nauru. Our priority is for women and children to move off Nauru as quickly as possible, and noting that there are no women and children on Manus, nonetheless we've already had the first uptake of 53 people between Manus and Nauru, and we're working with the United States to make sure that people can move out as quickly as possible. What we need to do in all of this is to make sure that we don't get new boat arrivals, because those new arrivals would be relocated to Nauru. They would be held there, and we've been very clear about the fact that we don't want people under any circumstance to come to Australia if they've sought to arrive by boat, because we aren't going to allow those people.
The Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Yeah, just a point of order. My question is about relevance, particularly about medical and healthcare, torture and trauma services.
The member for Indi will resume his seat. The Minister.
Mr Speaker, and I was coming to that point, the services that the member provides, well, nothing was provided by Labor. You put the people there. Okay, so I'm not going to be lectured. I'm not going to be lectured by Labor. I'm hardly going to be lectured by Labor. The honourable member has a much more distinguished record in this area and has the ability to ask these questions sincerely. The services she speaks of will continue to be provided out of the East Lorengau Centre, and there will be transport arrangements from the new centres to transport people on a regular basis to East Lorengau to receive.
The member for Brisbane.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to put downward pressure on power bills, and how our guarantee of affordable and reliable energy will help hard-working Australians and businesses get ahead? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Brisbane for his question, and know that he and his constituents have been paying the high price of the Palaszczuk government's electricity tax, because it's been those government-owned generators in Queensland that have been bidding in at artificially high prices to line the coffers of the Labor government and put this hidden electricity tax on the people of Queensland, Mr Speaker. And that is why he, like those on this side of the House, welcome the efforts of the Turnbull government to ensure that we rein in the power of the networks, passing legislation through the parliament last week to abolish LMR, the work that we've done with retailers, which is saving millions of Australian families hundreds of dollars a week by getting a better deal from their retailers, and the work we're doing with gas, intervening in the market to ensure Australians get access to gas before it is shipped overseas. And the National Energy Guarantee is another step in the right direction. And indeed, the Grattan Institute has said it's the last piece in the jigsaw puzzle of climate and energy policy, Mr Speaker, and it's been welcomed by the biggest employers in Australia, like BlueScope and BHP, the manufacturers, the irrigators, the grocers, Mr Speaker, the energy companies themselves, the BCA, the Australian Industry Group, ACCI and the like, and COSBOA, Mr Speaker, right across the board. But I'm asked, are there been any alternative approaches? Well, we know that the Labor Party, the party of cash for clunkers, the Citizens Assembly, the CPRS, the ETS, the EIS and the $15 billion carbon tax had 4 different positions last week. 4 different positions. Because on Monday the Leader of the Opposition went out and he did a doorstop and he said, and I quote, that the clean energy target was their position. But the member for Watson didn't get the memo, Mr Speaker, because last Thursday he went on Sky and he said bipartisan agreement is in the long-term interests of the country and we're not rushing to oppose the National Energy Guarantee. And then the member for Sydney, the deputy to the Leader of the Opposition, she didn't interview on Thursday. She was asked, what is the Labor Party's policy? And she said, our emissions intensity scheme is our preferred model, Mr Speaker. And then the man of the moment, the member for Port Adelaide, who put out a book where he accepted the Labor Party had sent mixed signals, Mr Speaker, and had made mistakes in the past. He was asked in an interview on Sunday, what is Labor's plans? Well, he said the only thing we're committed to is a 50% renewable energy target, Mr Speaker. So 4 different positions in 1 week. The Labor Party's flailing around, looking for a position. Well, you called for bipartisanship, you called for the advice of the experts. The Energy Security Board have provided it, and it's the key to lower prices and a more reliable system. It's time you got on board.
Has concluded. The member for Greenway has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised Australians that his second-rate copper NBN would be fast, affordable, sooner. Given we now know his second-rate copper NBN is slower than Labor's, has doubled in cost and was not delivered when he promised, when will the Prime Minister take any responsibility for the fact that his NBN is in fact slower, more expensive and late?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure, representing the Minister for Communications. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to look further into the comparative records of the Labor Party and the Coalition when it comes to rolling out the NBN, because it really is extraordinary that Labor keeps coming up and hitting their head against a brick wall on this particular topic. I think it's instructive. To have a look. At what Labor promised in the first NBN corporate plan, 2011 to 2013. By June 30, 2011, there were to be 223,000 premises passed. Actual number passed, 10,575. That's actually less than 10%. By June 30, 2012, there were to be 496,000 premises passed. Actual premises passed, 95,799. By June 30, 2013, there were to be 1.7 million premises passed. They were really building confidence. Actually, 282,000. That is on any assessment, that is a dismal record of rank incompetence. It's also very instructive to look at what the NBN committed to when the Coalition came to power and what has been delivered. Because what was committed by June 30, 2015 was 1.093 million. What was delivered was 1.165 million. By June 30, 2016, what was committed was 2.632 million. What was delivered was 2.893 million. June 30, 2017, what was committed, 5,442,000 premises passed or covered, actually delivered 5,713,000 premises. So a very consistent record under the Coalition government of consistently delivering what has been committed to, compared to the record under Labor of consistently and by a very wide margin failing to deliver on what was in the business plan. Now, very few people on this side have worked in business, but many of us on this side have, and we know if you saw that kind of performance in the business world, you'd be out, you'd be sacked, you'd be gone, and that's what all of you deserve when it comes to NBN.
Members on both sides. The member for Maranoa.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture, Water Resources and Northern Australia. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on actions the government is taking to ensure energy is reliable and affordable for hard-working farmers and regional communities like those in my electorate of Maranoa? Is he aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And the honourable member is very aware of how we're making sure that the people in Augathella or in Birdsville, we actually got a new optic fibre out there to Birdsville as part of the Coalition's telecommunications. The people in Dalby, people in Dirranbandy, how we are making sure that their power remains both reliable and affordable. It is vitally important. And one of the key components the member for Maranoa would be aware of is our belief in baseload power, especially baseload power from such things as the three coal-fired power stations in the member's electorate. The coal-fired power stations at Millmerran, Tarong, there's actually 2 power stations at Tarong, and also at Kogan Creek. We believe in this baseload power stations because we must get baseload onto the grid to keep the power and keep the lights on. This is despite the fact that Queensland is currently gouging the system. The Queensland state government is gouging the system and pulling dividends out of the system in such a way as we saw $4.1 billion in borrowings come off its accounts by basically gouging ergon and making sure that the poles and wires paid for by the people therefore pay off the incompetence of the state Labor government. Now, in this process, we are making sure that we stand behind the blue-collar workers that are in the member for Maranoa's seat. We do not believe that blue-collar workers are politically incorrect. We believe that blue-collar workers deserve the respect of a job. Those blue-collar workers at the Yarraman timber mill, those blue-collar workers at the goat abattoir at Charleville, those blue-collar workers who you'll find at Oakey, the blue-collar workers you'll find in the pork abattoir at Kingaroy, the blue-collar workers looking at chasing gas all through the system and making sure that money goes back to the towns. Now, you asked if there are any alternate policies, and there is one. The Labor Party believes in 50% renewables. The member for Maribyrnong, who has his back turned to me again today, as he always has his back turned to us, the member for Maribyrnong, who has his back turned on blue-collar workers, the member for Maribyrnong, who does not stand behind blue-collar workers, who turns his back on blue-collar workers. Well, his policy is 50% renewables, 45% emission reduction target and 0 net emissions by 2050. Now, he's been rather silent on this policy, and I think the question is whether the member for Maribyrnong, the leader of the Labor Party, the party that once upon a time believed in labourers, didn't turn their back on labourers, whether he wants to come to the dispatch box and once more re-announce his belief that blue-collar workers should be put out of a job, whether he once again can turn his back on blue-collar workers and instead of looking after blue-collar workers, he returns to his eternal pursuit of crystals for negative ions and turmeric lattes and looking after all the people in Balmain, but nobody in Birdsville.
The member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Industry Conveyancing Australia employs over 90 people in my electorate, is less than 5 kilometres from the CBD and needs very fast internet to share 3D files. Is the Prime Minister aware that because of his incompetent handling of the NBN, the business has been allocated a satellite connection when its neighbours just 650 metres away can get fibre? Given that we are now in the Prime Minister's 5th year of mismanagement of the NBN, isn't it clear that the Prime Minister—
The member for Bendigo's time has concluded. And there was no question. The members on my right will sit down. The Manager of Opposition Business. The Manager of Opposition Business. The member for Sydney.
Mr. Speaker,
no, members on my right will allow me to hear the member for Sydney.
Mr. Speaker, there was plainly a question in there. The question was—
Members on my right.
Is—
There was. No, members on my right are delaying question time.
The question was in the second paragraph, is the Prime Minister aware of the different treatment of these businesses? Is he aware?
Yes. The member for Sydney's made her point of order. She doesn't have to. I've listened to her carefully, and that is correct. I'll allow the Prime Minister to address that very part of the question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last words before she ran out of time were, "Isn't it clear?" And it is very clear that the Labor Party has abandoned any pretence at presenting a policy on energy. Mr. Speaker, last week the recommendations of the Energy Security Board were being condemned out of hand. Nonsense,
the member for
the
Griffith
Leader of
is
the Opposition said. Science fiction, he went on to add, indicating perhaps his taste in literature. But, Mr. Speaker, we have no questions on energy now. They've lost interest in that. And as to the NBN, Mr. Speaker, I'll say to the honourable member, the particular
member for Bendigo will cease interjecting. Prime Minister resume his seat. The member for Bendigo will cease interjecting. She's interjecting continually through the answer. I've allowed the question. I listened to the member for Sydney and she was right. The Prime Minister is answering that part of the question that was asked. If the member for Bendigo insists on interjecting directly at the Prime Minister continuously, she'll leave the chamber. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what is very clear about the NBN is that we inherited a complete mess from the Labor Party, just as we did on energy policy, I might add. And as with energy policy, we are fixing it and turning it around, cleaning it up. Now, with the NBN, the honourable member raises a particular case, and we'll take note of that, and we'll make sure that the NBN get an answer from the NBN.
For a second. The member for Bendigo will leave under 94A. The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call, or has he concluded his answer? The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the Minister update the House on how the government's commitment to guaranteeing an affordable and reliable energy supply is critical to generating a stronger economy with more jobs? How does a fragile energy market jeopardise the prosperity of our economy?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. Mr. Speaker, the member for Boothby will remember that last week it was announced that the Turnbull government had presided over 371,000 new jobs in the last 12 months, Mr. Speaker. Now, a lot of people might have thought that that was hard to improve upon. That was such a stunning number. How do you get more jobs out of the economy? Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a way. And you can actually solve the energy issue, which is exactly what this government is trying to do, which I note, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition has given up on today, completely given up on energy, the issue that our constituents raise with us everywhere we go, which is affordable power and reliable power. Labor has not asked one question about it today, Mr. Speaker. Instead, they've given up on energy, but this side of the House hasn't. We know that if we can bring about affordable and reliable energy, it'll create even more jobs than the 371,000 that we announced last week. It's good for investment, it's good for jobs, it's good for growth. As recently as today, Mr. Speaker, it was revealed that AEMO has intervened in the South Australian energy market 5 times in the last 6 weeks to keep the lights on in South Australia, Mr. Speaker. 5 times in the last 6 weeks, and it's only spring, Mr. Speaker. Imagine how fearful older people in their homes, businesses, hard-working Australian families, imagine how concerned they are about the approaching summer, Mr. Speaker. And so what we're calling on the South Australian government to do, Mr. Speaker, is get on board with this government's Australian Energy Guarantee. The Australian Energy Guarantee has the capability to solve the energy crisis in this country by increasing supply and capacity in the market, driving down prices and therefore, as a consequence, ensuring more reliable supply and more affordable prices for businesses and households. We don't want the Premier Jay Weatherill or Tom Koutsintonis standing on the platform forlornly as the train pulls out, Mr Speaker. The Australian public are not interested in people playing politics on energy prices in Australia. They're not interested in the Labor Party wanting to play the old politics of negativity and division. What they want is to see at CORAG in November the state and territory governments getting on board with this government's attempt at solving one of the most significant issues facing households and businesses every day. We don't want the snake oil salesman, the Leader of the Opposition, pretending to be bipartisan, offering support, when in fact all he wants is a political fight. On this occasion, the Labor Party needs to support the households and businesses of Australia.
Has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's latest energy policy. On the 1st of July, electricity prices for the average Energy Australia household in New South Wales increased by nearly 20%. So does the Prime Minister seriously expect people in New South Wales to thank him for a lousy 50-cent a week saving they might get in 3 years' time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, people in New South Wales will certainly not thank the honourable member opposite for his efforts to impose on them the South Australian solution, which of course is to have the most expensive and the least reliable electricity in the country. The reality is, Mr Speaker, that the Labor Party's failures in energy have created the problems we face today. The honourable member opposite, who asked the question, first said that to Barry Cassidy, he said that Labor had no idea that allowing the export of gas from the East Coast could result in higher prices and tight supply. He said no warnings. It came as a bolt out of the blue, apparently. But then, Mr Speaker, when it became obvious this ridiculous position could not be sustained, because not only had the warnings come from the public service, from the Department of Energy, but they'd come from the energy market operator. He had to then turn around and make a belated confession. Mr Speaker, the rise in the price of gas was entirely a consequence of Labor Party's failure to apply any level of business competence to the management of national energy policy. Despite warnings to the contrary, they allowed gas to be exported from the East Coast without any effort to protect the domestic market. Now we have addressed that challenge. Gas is now flowing, and as we heard today when I was there with Senator Zazelja and the Minister for Energy at Viridian Glass today, we heard Rob Sindel, Chief Executive of CSR, noting the advantage or the benefits that are flowing from our action on gas, and noting that wholesale spot prices have been coming down since our actions. That is an example of delivery, of real action to deliver a drop in gas prices that, of course, is going to be important to ensure the viability of so many businesses. But, Mr Speaker, the honourable member makes up figures. Was it 50 cents a week or something? He can make up all of these figures he likes. The reality is this: he knows that we have a policy recommended by the Energy Security Board, independent, expert, which says that there will be, they expect there to be a 20 to 25% reduction in wholesale costs over the period, and that would be reflected, they estimate, in $110 to $115 a year reduction in electricity bills for retail customers.
The member for DURACK.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the government's National Energy Guarantee will support hard-working Australians and businesses and drive investment and jobs growth in the economy. Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for DURACK for her question, and I know she works hard each and every day to deliver for those members in her community. She knows that you've got to get the policy settings right. You need to make sure that you drive investment in your community in order to deliver a strong economy, and that is exactly what we are doing on this side of the House. That's why we had good news last week that saw the coalition government being able to deliver more than 371,000 new jobs in the last 12 months alone. But we know that there are threats to this. If we are not able to have affordable and reliable energy, we will not be able to continue to deliver the jobs that we need in Australia. That is why on this side of the House we are delivering the National Energy Guarantee that will fix the broken energy policy that has existed in this parliament and in this economy for too long. It will guarantee reliable energy by delivering the right level of dispatchable baseload energy at the appropriate points in time. And as a result, Australian businesses will be able to have confidence that they can keep the lights on, that they can continue to employ, that they can continue to invest. It is important for both domestic and international investors to have confidence to be able to invest here in our economy and boost jobs. But she has asked, are there any alternatives? And she is right, there are. The Labor Party over there has got an energy thought bubble. An energy thought bubble that comprises renewable energy targets that are reckless, and they combine that with billions of dollars in subsidies and taxes, which will mean higher taxes and less reliability for Australian families and Australian businesses. Labor wants Australian consumers to pay for their $66 billion subsidy. And while they are happy to slug Australians and Australian employers with higher energy prices, they have forgotten one of the core responsibilities of government is to deliver reliable and affordable energy, to keep the lights on and to keep the economy running. Labor have no plan whatsoever to do anything on energy unless, of course, the wind is blowing, and the wind is certainly blowing over there, or unless the sun is shining.
Members
and
on my
they will
left.
cost Australian businesses and Australian jobs if they put in place their energy thought bubble. The National Energy Guarantee, which we will deliver for all Australia.
Concluded. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Thanks to this Prime Minister and legislation being debated in the parliament today, someone earning $60,000 is guaranteed a tax hike of $300 a year. Yet the Prime Minister can't even guarantee they'll save a lousy 50 cents a week on their energy bills in 3 years' time. Why is the only guarantee that this Prime Minister can make is that, thanks to him, working Australians will always have less?
The Prime Minister has...
Mr Speaker, Australians know that Labor governments can be guaranteed to deliver higher energy prices and less reliable energy. The Labor Party's track record, Mr Speaker, 100%. Whether it comes to border protection, whether it comes to the NBN, whether it comes to energy, reveals astounding incompetence, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party has demonstrated, both at the federal level and at the state level, particularly in South Australia, that they cannot be trusted with energy policy, that their incompetence, the combination of ideology and idiocy, results in less affordable, more expensive energy and less reliable energy. So the lights don't stay on, the air conditioners don't stay on, the hospitals don't have their plant running. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party's failure to look after Australia's energy security is one of their great failures in government, and it goes hand in hand with all of those examples of Labor incompetence, whether it's failing to protect our borders, whether it's failing to defend the integrity of our nation's borders, whether it's their incompetence with the NBN, wasting billions of dollars in sheer mismanagement, or whether it is putting our energy security at risk. The Labor Party cannot manage. They are incompetent, and it's been proved by them again and again.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House the importance of affordable and reliable energy for Victoria's rural and regional hospitals, such as Horsham Hospital? Is the minister aware of any threats that undermine the delivery of services of regional hospitals?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mallee, who's been a passionate advocate for Horsham Hospital, for Corang Hospital, for West Wimmera hospital services in areas such as Nicolle and Japarra. But one of the things he knows as a practical farmer is that if you can't keep the lights on, you can't run a hospital service, you can't take care of people, and there are two fundamental approaches to electricity affordability in this House. On the one side, a constant push for downward pressure on electricity prices and to increase electricity reliability on our side. And whether that involves the abolition of Labor's electricity tax, its carbon tax, whether that involves pushing to overturn the approaches in South Australia and Victoria, which have created massive electricity instability and price hikes, or whether that involves opposing Labor's new $66 billion electricity tax, our side is consistent. We believe and we practice policy which pushes down electricity prices. By comparison, there's a very different approach, a very different philosophy, a very different belief on their side of higher electricity prices and higher electricity taxes. This is why we have seen in Victoria Horsham Hospital hit with a potential $500,000 increase in its electricity prices this year as part of a $44 million increase in electricity prices for Victoria's hospitals, why we've seen a $370,000 hit to the West Wimmera Hospital service, why Corang has been hit, and why Bendigo the Bendigo region has also been hit. So what we see is a deliberate outcome of deliberate Labor policy, where they intentionally took action to close down the Hazelwood Power Station in Victoria and to blow up the Northern Power Station in South Australia. And the outcome for that was higher electricity prices. On this side, what we've seen is not just the abolition of the last electricity tax, not just opposition to the next electricity tax, but the Prime Minister's work and the Energy Minister's work with the National Energy Guarantee. And these things are about making sure that you can keep the lights on for the homes, for the pensioners, for the community centres and in particular for the hospitals. Because when you rip $44 million out of the hospital service by placing massive high electricity taxes on them, you are hurting hospital services in Victoria. The significance is real and the opportunity cost is profoundly important. At the end of the day, there are two fundamental approaches. One is we have an approach to downwards pressure on electricity prices. On the other, they have a $66 billion electricity tax.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that under his government power prices have never been higher, pensioners will lose their energy supplements, weekend workers lose their penalty rates, low and middle income families face a tax hike, and the only benefit that anyone can look forward to is a lousy 50 cents a week in 3 years' time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, I've dealt with these issues in many answers before, but there is one set of statistics that I can confirm, and that is in the last 12 months, 371,500 jobs were created in Australia, of which 315,900 were full-time. And Mr Speaker, that does compare with another 12-month period. The last 12 months when the Leader of the Opposition was Employment Minister. And during that time, Mr Speaker, there was 129,000 jobs created, of which only 32,900 were full-time. Mr Speaker, nearly 3 times as many jobs created in the last 12 months as in the last 12 months when he had responsibility for employment.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on action the government is taking to protect Australian families from criminal gang members and individuals who pose a national security risk? Is the Minister aware of any inadequate approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I want to thank him for his support and all of the members on this side of the House for the support that we're doing in clamping down on criminals who are committing violent offences against Australian citizens. We've ramped up the number of visas that we've cancelled of non-citizens, people that have committed serious crimes against Australians. The number is up by 1,200%, and it includes, importantly, Mr Speaker, 40 visas on national security grounds. So significantly, 40 people who would pose an extreme risk to the Australian community have had their visas cancelled and either have been deported or are in the process of being deported. Now, this government will always look, Mr Speaker, for more ways in which we can strengthen our national security laws, ways in which we can strengthen our border security to keep Australians safe. That's what the Australian public wants, and that is what, Mr Speaker, this government delivers. Now, the government will always look at new approaches and listen to new ideas about how we can strengthen those laws, and I want to praise the member for Latrobe, who is a former counter-terrorism officer in Victoria. He's working on a committee at the moment, Mr Speaker, looking at ways in which laws can be strengthened, and to his great credit, he has proposed an intervention order regime to help de-radicalise extremists. And I was interested to read an article in the Herald Sun, October 18 of this year, where it details support for that scheme by the Police Federation of Australia Chief Mark Burgess, who represents 60,000 police officers. He supported in principle this intervention scheme, and the way in which it would operate is that the order would result in extremists being banned from accessing radical content online, interacting with other extremists and going to specified places of worship. Now, you'd imagine, Mr Speaker, that there would be widespread support for such a proposal. However, there is not. There's one person in this House, and I fear that I will embarrass him by naming him in this debate. It's the case that this individual doesn't like his name being mentioned on Hansard during the course of question time. It's my old friend, the member for Blair. Remember him? He smiled. That's the first facial expression during this question time. Well done. Well done to the member for Blair for that mild reaction. Well done. Now, he has opposed this change, Mr Speaker. This is his quote in relation to the member for Latrobe's suggestion. He says this is real nanny state stuff. This is almost totalitarian intervention into people's domestic and family life without the individual committing any act. Now, Mr Speaker, at the next election, if you want a weak approach to border protection, if you want a weak approach to national security, go with him. Go with him, and go with him is my advice, Mr Speaker. He is the weakest link in the chain, and he's the weakest link on the opposition.
The member for Whitlam has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When asked about the decision to contract out the announcement of $15 million of government grants to One Nation, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Grants of all kinds are approved in the usual way." Is it also usual for the government grants to be announced by non-government members and senators, in this case with oversized cheques bearing large photos of the heads of One Nation senators Hanson and Roberts? And if there is now a coalition agreement with One Nation, will the Prime Minister table a copy of that agreement right now?
The member's time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I refer the honourable member to my earlier answer that he obviously noted, and all government grants are approved by the appropriate ministers in the normal way.
Members on both sides. The member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to further strengthen the security at Australian airports? Why is proactive action needed to keep Australians safe?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would like to thank the member for Banks for his question and note the member for Banks' keen interest in all matters relating to national security. And, Mr Speaker, as you'd be aware, and I'm sure all members are aware, the government takes the safety of all Australians as its utmost priority. And one area of public policy which the Prime Minister himself has indicated there is never a cause for set and forget is in relation to transport security. And as a government, we are working to be eternally vigilant to make sure we can protect Australians from those who seek to do us harm. And I want to assure the Australian travelling public, Mr Speaker, I want to assure the Australian travelling public, I am surprised that those opposite are actually seeking to interject during a conversation on national security. I'd encourage the member for McMahon just to quieten down for a second and actually appreciate the comments I'm making in relation to security of people as they travel through Australia's major airports. So the Office of Transport Security, Mr Speaker, is working with the government on new and emerging threats, and one of those threats is that of the insider threat. And I announced over the weekend a new measure dealing with 9 of Australia's major airports, which focuses on the insider threat. And when we talk about the insider threat, Mr Speaker, we're talking about those who have privileged access to parts of an airport where they may have the opportunity to seek to do us harm if that is their ambition. Now, members will recall amendments to the Aviation Transport Security Act, which passed the parliament earlier this year, and I acknowledge the member for Greenway engaged quite constructively at that time in relation to the measures we took under those amendments to the Aviation Transport Security Act. And the new regulations that came from those amendments, Mr Speaker, dealt with improved access control, with random screening for explosives and also with additional airside security training. Now, Mr Speaker, there are in the order of 140,000 people who have what we call ASIC cards, the Aviation Security Identification Cards, and that allows them, through their various roles at our airports, to have access, whether they're baggage handlers, engineers or involved with catering, they have access to secure parts of our airports. And the vast majority of those people, Mr Speaker, I must emphasise, the vast majority of those people are there to do the right thing. They want to do their job, they want to go home safe, they want to keep us safe as we go about our travels. There is a capacity, though, Mr Speaker, for those who would seek to do us harm to do so. And what we've introduced, Mr Speaker, is random and unpredictable explosive trace detection tests, both at screening points and also in the workplace. So there's a capacity for random checks of ASIC card holders as they go about their jobs. There is also an opportunity, Mr Speaker, for additional training in security matters to make sure that all ASIC card holders are aware of their responsibilities to be vigilant in the workplace. These measures, Mr Speaker, are aimed at keeping Australians safer. They'll be progressively implemented over the coming months. We expect full implementation at our 9 major airports by January 2019. And more broadly, Mr Speaker, can I indicate that the Inspector of Transport Security is also undertaking a review into 173 regulated airports and will report back to me by Christmas. We are taking action to make our strong system even stronger.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Blackstone. Sorry.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Building the South Rockhampton flood levy would protect 1,200 homes and could reduce insurance premiums for Rockhampton households by up to $400 a year. Rockhampton Council, the Queensland Labor Government and Federal Labor have all committed to funding it. Will it take another devastating flood for the Prime Minister to commit funding to build the levy and protect Rocky homes and businesses?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left.
I thank the honourable member for his question. And I think it's quite a change to actually get a question on water policy. I think it's the first one I've ever got, and it's amazing that they'd give it on something on Central Queensland. In Central Queensland, where at Rockhampton we have put $130 million on the table and the money for the feasibility study to construct Rookwood Weir, and the Labor Party has done nothing. Absolutely nothing. Completely and utterly deserted the people of Central Queensland. Completely and utterly deserted the people of Central Queensland. And it's amazing that what happens with the Labor Party when they are so completely incompetent in the construction of water infrastructure. We have not got back. We want to help Queensland out. We've got so many proposals out there for Nathan Dam, Nalinga Dam, Rookwood Weir, and the Labor Party just does not want to engage. They do not want to engage in water policy. And you know why they don't want to engage in water policy? Because of the Greens. Because of the Greens. No, they're fighting for the frogs up in Queensland, the Labor Party.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. Deputy Prime Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The member for Blaxland on a point of order.
The question was about the Rocky Flood Levy.
The
Answer the question or sit down.
Resume his seat. The member for Blaxland, the Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Blaxland can raise a point of order, but he's not going to give directions on what anyone should do in this place if he wishes to stay in here. The member for Blaxland is warned. The Deputy Prime Minister.
I must say he's rather terrifying, Mr. Speaker. He's rather terrifying. And if we can go on, we can see in central Queensland where the member for Capricornia with the Yeppen floodplain, with the roads on the Bruce Highway, she's fighting for Rookwood. And the issues, of course, where's the levy bank? With the levy bank, you want to hear about the levy bank? No, they won't yell. The levy bank, of course, it's a very divisive issue because you've got two lots of people. You've got the people inside the levy bank who want the levy bank, and then you've got all the people outside the levy bank, and you should go up to central Queensland and talk to them. They're not so keen on the idea. They're not so keen on the idea. So the member for Capricornia is doing the diligent work in assessing whether the balance of goodness is making sure we flood more people outside the levy bank or save the people inside the levy bank. But in the meantime, you can reduce some of the water going to Rockhampton by building the Rookwood Weir. But why does the Labor Party always turn its back on blue-collar workers? That is the question that so many people in central Queensland want to know. Why is it with the extra $1 billion worth of income, the extra $1 billion income that would come from the Rookwood Weir, they have said nothing in support of those blue-collar workers? Why is it on the back of the thousands of jobs that would come from the Rookwood Weir, they've said nothing for those blue-collar workers? They never stand up for workers. They always stand up for the inner suburbs. And when we go up to talk about the Rookwood Weir, guess what they want to talk about? Jackie Trad. That's what they want to talk about. Jackie Trad and the Cross River Rail. That's about as close as they ever get to central Queensland. About as close as they ever get to central Queensland. So we'll stand up for the coal workers of central Queensland. We'll stand up for Rookwood Weir, and you just keep fighting for the wind chimes, old trout.
The member for Barara.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Today is the 75th anniversary of the Battle of El Alamein, and next week we will see the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba. Would the Minister update the House on what the government is doing to commemorate these two significant events?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
I think so.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question, and I know of his deep and abiding interest in the Battle of Beersheba. Today marks the anniversary of the second of three major battles that occurred around El Alamein in Egypt between July and November 1942, where the Australian forces suffered almost 6,000 casualties over a period of 5 months. The Battle of El Alamein proved to be the turning point of the war in North Africa, where Rommel and his Panzer Army were repelled and the Axis forces were subsequently driven from the continent. Earlier today, 23 veterans of the campaign attended a reception in their honour, and later today they will participate in a last post ceremony at the Australian War Memorial, and I know the opposition will be represented at that as well. It will be an honour to welcome these veterans to the War Memorial on the 75th anniversary of the Battle of El Alamein. To give you an idea of the mettle of these men, one of my constituents, Max Hammond, was going to come to the War Memorial today, but unfortunately, and he's in his mid-90s, he had a heart attack 2 weeks ago. But he came into my electorate office today and wanted to apologise to the government because he wouldn't be there. Obviously, the message that I gave back was he didn't need to apologise. It is us, all of us, and every Australian who needs to thank him and all those veterans who served in North Africa. Next week we will also commemorate the centenary of the charge of the Light Horse at the Battle of Beersheba in what now is Israel. It was one of the great cavalry charges. The Australian Light Horse attacked the enemy lines defending the town of Beersheba. About 800 Australians from the 4th and 12th Light Horse Regiments were involved in the charge, suffering 31 deaths and 36 wounded. They captured more than 700 Turkish soldiers and secured a vital water source for Allied troops in the Middle East. Some members of this parliament will travel to Israel to commemorate this significant battle next week and the service and sacrifice of the Australians who participated. During the centenary of Anzac period, I ask all Australians to pause and reflect on the service and sacrifice of the Australians and all those who have served, lest we forget.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Minister for his answer. And as we reflect on the courage and the sacrifice that secured the freedoms we exercise in this parliament, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The Leader of the House with papers.
Thank you.